November 1943. The waters of the Solomon Sea moved in long, dark swells beneath a moonless sky, and a Japanese destroyer squadron threading through them did so with the particular confidence of men who had learned, through 2 years of hard Pacific fighting, that darkness was their most reliable ally. Commander Matsuji Ijuin stood on the bridge of his lead destroyer and felt the night close around his formation like a hand, concealing, protecting, offering the operational freedom that daylight had long since ceased to provide. The American air threat was real, and it was severe, but it was by every calculation his experience supported a daylight threat. Aircraft needed to see their targets. Pilots needed horizons and reference points and the basic visual information that night systematically denied them. The darkness was not comfortable, but it was safe. Then the sky turned white. Not the brief flash of an explosion, not the guttering orange of a burning ship, but a sustained, brilliant, descending wall of chemical light that erased the darkness across miles of ocean surface and left every vessel in the formation outlined against the sea as clearly as though the sun had returned at midnight. Ijuin gripped the bridge rail, had revealed. The assessment took seconds. The attack followed, and the night, which had been the foundation of his operational doctrine, was gone. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories history almost forgot, and we find them every week. To understand the strategic weight of what Ijuin experienced, one must return to the foundational role that night operations played in Japan's naval calculus by late 1943. The Imperial Navy had entered the war with a night fighting capability that was, by any honest assessment, among the finest in the world. Its sailors had trained in conditions of reduced visibility with an intensity that few navies matched. Its torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, running on pure oxygen rather than compressed air, leaving no telltale bubble trail, carrying a warhead of extraordinary power, were optimized for exactly the kind of close-range night engagement that darkness made possible. In the battles around Guadalcanal in 1942, this combination of training and equipment had produced results that shocked American surface commanders. Savo Island, where Japanese cruisers had destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers in a night action of devastating efficiency. These victories had confirmed what Japanese naval doctrine had long asserted, that the disciplined, technically prepared night fighter could neutralize the American advantage in firepower and numbers by denying the conditions under which that advantage could be applied. The night was not merely useful. It was the operational foundation of Japan's remaining capacity to contest American naval dominance in the southwestern Pacific. Without it, the surface forces that Japan could still put to sea were exposed to the full weight of American air power. With it, they retained the ability to move, to supply, to strike, to maintain the pretense, at least, of operational freedom in waters that daylight had made increasingly lethal. The flare bomb dissolved that pretense. It did so not through any single spectacular engagement, but through the cumulative logic of a technology that made the night's concealing function conditional rather than absolute, available only until the American aircraft arrived overhead, at which point it ceased with a totality and an immediacy that no evasive maneuver and no amount of anti-aircraft fire could reliably prevent. The development of airborne illumination systems for naval strike operations had proceeded through the American military and scientific establishment with the pragmatic urgency that characterized American weapons development throughout the war. The problem was straightforward in its definition. American aircraft operating in support of naval operations in the Pacific were losing the night hours to Japanese surface forces that used darkness to move and supply and attack with a freedom that daylight denied them. The solution required making darkness operationally irrelevant, not by improving visual capability in conditions of low light, which the technology of the period could accomplish only modestly, but by eliminating the darkness itself over a target area for the duration required to conduct an effective strike. The flare bomb accomplished this through the chemical production of intense white light, sustained by a parachute descent that slowed the flare's fall and extended its illumination window to the point where attacking aircraft had sufficient time to identify, approach, and strike their targets. The specific systems deployed in Pacific naval strike operations by 1943 and 1944 produced illumination of a quality that the men receiving it found genuinely disorienting in its completeness. The light was not directional, not limited to a narrow beam that a ship might maneuver out of. It fell across the ocean's surface in a broad, sustained cone that covered an area of several square miles and made every object within that area as visible from altitude as it would have been in full daylight. Japanese destroyer commanders whose operational doctrine had been built on the assumption that darkness provided a reliable reduction in targeting accuracy found themselves, under the flares, stripped of that assumption in a way that exposed the structural dependence of their entire tactical system on a condition that could now be revoked. The coordination between the aircraft delivering the flares and those conducting the actual strike was, in its mature form, a carefully choreographed sequence that reflected months of operational refinement. Pathfinder aircraft, typically equipped with the radar systems that allowed them to locate surface targets in complete darkness, arrived over the target area first and released their flares at altitudes and intervals calculated to provide sustained illumination for the strike aircraft following behind. The strike aircraft, torpedo bombers, glide bombers, increasingly the versatile aircraft that Pacific Air Power had developed through the attrition of 3 years of combat, arrived into an illuminated environment in which their pilots could conduct visual attacks of a precision that radar alone, in its 1943 state of development, could not fully replicate. The sequence transformed what had been a technological limitation, the inability of aircraft to attack with full effectiveness in darkness, into a tactical system that turned the Japanese reliance on darkness into a vulnerability rather than an asset. Japanese after-action reports from engagements conducted under American flare illumination through 1943 and in a 1944 document the response of surface commanders to the experience with a specificity that illuminates both the tactical disruption and the deeper psychological dimensions of what they were encountering. The tactical disruption is clearly recorded. The flares negated the night fighting doctrine, exposed formations to strike aircraft that should have been operationally blind, and produced losses in engagements where the Japanese side had expected the conditions of darkness to provide a compensating advantage. The psychological dimension is recorded between the lines of official reporting in a language that commanders reached for when they attempted to describe the quality of the experience rather than merely its tactical consequences. What those commanders were describing was the specific terror of environmental betrayal. The night had been a known quantity. It had been trained for, planned around, depended upon in the most operationally critical sense. The sense in which a commander's judgment about what is possible in a given situation rests on assumptions about the environment that the environment is expected to honor. The flare violated that expectation not incrementally, but absolutely. There was no partial illumination, no gradual degradation of the darkness that might have allowed, and then there was light, and the light was complete, and the concealment was gone, and the aircraft were already in their attack runs before the first defensive response could be organized. The specific terror of this experience was, by the testimony of survivors, qualitatively different from the terror of conventional air attack in daylight. Daylight attack was known. It was dangerous and it was costly, but it operated within a framework that Japanese naval doctrine had developed responses to evasive maneuvering, anti-aircraft fire, the tactical positioning of formations to reduce exposure. Night attack under flare illumination operated within none of these frameworks, because the frameworks had been built for conditions that the flares eliminated. The commanders on those bridges were not merely facing a weapons system they had not encountered before. They were facing the collapse of the operational logic that had organized their understanding of what night combat meant, and doing so in real time, under fire, without the institutional machinery of deliberate doctrinal revision to help them integrate what was happening. The radar set that guided the Pathfinder aircraft to its release point over a Japanese formation in total darkness was, in its way, the same argument that the proximity fuse had made from inside an artillery shell and that the B-24's maritime patrol systems had made. From the silence of a long ocean transit, the argument that American scientific and industrial capacity had filled the invisible world with instruments of detection and destruction that made the traditional sanctuaries of warfare conditional rather than reliable. The darkness had been a sanctuary. The radar made it transparent. The flare made the transparency visible to everyone in the formation below. And the nation that produced the radar and the flare and the aircraft that carried them and the fuel that flew them and the trained crews that operated them was a nation that had never run short of any of these things, that had produced them all in quantities sufficient to deploy them not as exceptional resources to be husbanded carefully, but as standard operational tools available to every strike package that needed them. The tin of American aviation fuel that filled the Pathfinder's tanks for the long transit to the target area was the same argument as the flare it released over the darkened sea. An argument about abundance, so organized and so sustained that it could afford to turn the night itself into an operational resource, to treat darkness not as a limiting condition, but as a medium to be illuminated and exploited, because the technology and the fuel and the trained personnel to do so were simply there, as they always were, as they would continue to be. By 1944, Japanese surface commanders planning night operations in the southwestern Pacific had incorporated the flare threat into their operational calculus in ways that the calculus of 1942 had not required. Night transits were planned with awareness that darkness was no longer guaranteed. Anti-aircraft dispositions were revised to address the threat from illuminating aircraft rather than only from attacking ones. Route selection incorporated consideration of American patrol coverage in ways that constrained the operational freedom darkness had previously provided. All of these adjustments were rational responses to a documented threat. None of them restored what the flare had taken away, because what the flare had taken away was not a tactical option, but a foundational condition. The condition of invisibility that Japan's entire remaining surface warfare doctrine had been built around. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. The untold moments are the ones that explain the war, and we will keep finding them.